To have been asked to moderate this panel. Political communication is my specialty, so it was exciting reading these papers, and I'm happy to be here. Happy to be here listening to the following speakers present their papers. We're going to begin with Philip Abbott of Wayne State University, who will present his paper titled Decisions, 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 How George W. Bush Plays the Blame Game. And then Ann Burnette and Wayne Kraemer of Texas State University will discuss their paper, Communicating a Rationale for War, George W. Bush and the Rhetoric of Imperial Righteousness. And that'll be followed by Ben Voth of Southern Methodist University, who will be presenting his paper, President Bush's Rhetoric and Policy Against Genocide. The respondent to these papers is Peter Baker, who I understand is out making a phone call at the moment, but will be here shortly. He is the White House correspondent for the New York Times, contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, author of Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, and our Joseph Astman Distinguished Conference Scholar. Welcome him as he approaches. Well, welcome everybody, please. Thank you all for being here. Okay, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and Mr. Baker will respond for 15 or so minutes, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So with no further eloquence, I will be seated.
Good morning. The focus of my paper is the relationship between the memoir and an evaluation of a presidency, and particularly in this case, George W. Bush's decision points. As if any of you have ever read a presidential memoir, you'll know what a really difficult task this is, and you have to get a strong cup of coffee and a straight chair to deal with it. Presidential memoirs are defensive by nature. The memoir is a final opportunity to justify the policies of an administration. Yet despite these advantages, the memoirs have a tenuous hold on presidential legacies. They are almost invariably criticized as being self-serving, inaccurate portrayals of an administration, and sometimes questions are raised about their authorial sources itself. Critiques are especially critiques are especially intense for presidents whose administrations are regarded as failures. While the need to recover a reputation is urgent in these cases, the former president is burdened by the anticipation of a hostile reader and is almost always enforced to play what I call the blame game. He must present effective defenses of his administration. Since the initial assessments of the George W. Bush presidency, or at least some of them, have placed what Gene H. Baker has identified as the irredeemable group of the very worst presidents, President Bush is confronted with a task similar to others in this category, although his strategy is unique among presidential memoirs. Of those presidents that are so-called irredeemables, that is, they're in the bottom of the fourth quartile of presidential rankings, 5 have written memoirs. One was Ulysses Grant, who did not play the blame game at all, since his memoir ended before he took office. And actually, Grant is positively cited by President Bush in his decision points. President Coolidge wrote his autobiography before the Great Depression, so that leaves Hoover, Buchanan, and Richard Nixon as possible exemplars. All of these latter 3 engage in strategies of blame reversal. For Buchanan, the abolitionists were responsible for the Civil War, FDR for the Depression, Democrats and media for Watergate. Both Buchanan and Nixon added another strategy. Even if they engaged in blameworthy actions, they were mitigated by more positive ones. The inventiveness, I think, of the Bush memoir is, instead of proceeding chronologically or even sporadically, as Nixon does, between a chapter on Watergate and a chapter on his foreign policy, he organizes his memoirs as in terms of of decisions. And this makes, I think, a very effective strategy in terms of the blame game. From Bush's point of view, since many of the decisions that reach the president's desk are tough calls, winning strong arguments on both sides, Bush cannot easily be mistaken for making errors. Second, the president offers to explain to the reader the opinions I weighed and the principles I followed in making these decisions. And this also sort of counteracts the sort of folklore that the president wasn't somehow disengaged and other actors in his administration were actually the decision makers. There are a lot of strategies in the blame game. One is spreading the blame among others, reversing the blame. Bush's, if you look at two of his decisions on Iraq and Katrina, for instance, Bush engages in all these strategies, but he adds a sort of another one that social psychologists call the palliative excuse. And this is the sort of thing that, well, I was responsible for this action A, but I'm not to blame because my wife just left me, or I got bad news from the doctor. So this is a peculiar kind of excuse. And what Bush does in his memoirs is to use the palliative excuse very, very extensively, much more so than other memoirs like Rumsfeld and Rice and others. He admits that he should have pursued the problem of weapons of mass destruction more actively and more thoroughly. He defends the mission accomplished debacle by saying that he didn't see the sign behind him and he was just trying to support the soldiers. He defends the surge, but nevertheless says that perhaps that needed even more debate. He defends his decision to disband the Iraqi army by saying that, well, this probably could have used more thoughtful debate as well. On Katrina, he spreads the blame with the mayor of New Orleans and the governor of Louisiana, but then admits that he didn't express enough sympathy for the sufferers of the hurricane, and as a result, he was misunderstood. So I have a little bit of time left. Let me just sort of conclude by saying that it is unlikely that President Bush's innovative use of the memoir will elevate his standing significantly, although it is possible he might escape his current status as one of the irredeemables. The dramatic mistakes of his presidency, from the war in Iraq to the response to Katrina and the financial crisis and the links between them that point to a reckless and or incompetent presidency are largely, I think, inerasable. Nevertheless, the framework of decision points does provide a defense of these and other decisions that have not been employed by other presidential memoirs. In particular, Bush appears to have discovered a new form of the palliative excuse to deflect blame. Bush's excuses do not rely on the "I am not responsible because I was distracted or not in control," but rather that I was faced with a series of difficult decisions, and here are my reasons for them, and here are the mistakes I made in hindsight. Coupled with the more traditional tactics of the blame reversal and spreading the blame, Bush has played the blame game with finesse and originality, features that ironically seemed so lacking in his presidency. I think I got it. Thanks.
You may. Our next speakers are Burnette and Kraemer.
Hello, and thank you. We'll be talking about some of President Bush's rhetoric justifying the wars during his administration. And wars are waged through words as well as weapons. The rhetoric that defines a nation's interests, justifies aggressive actions, and exhorts a people to support their leaders as they commit to military operations is a crucial component in any country's war effort. No American president could mount a war without public discourse to explain and justify the war. Even in a situation where a country's been attacked on its home soil, as the United States was on September 11th, 2001, rhetoric is necessary to contextualize the attack, give it meaning, and frame the appropriate response to it. So in this paper, this is an extension of some work that we've been doing on President Bush's war rhetoric, and we developed a framework called the Rhetoric of Imperial Righteousness to describe the justifications that he makes for his war actions in his administration. So we go into quite a bit of detail in this paper and in our previous work about how that framework developed. And we also, in other papers, had looked at some of President Bush's speeches immediately after 9/11, as well as his State of the Union addresses and his national security strategies. In this paper, we're going to look specifically at two speeches during his presidency. One was given at the 5-year anniversary of September 11th, so that was on September 11th, 2006. And the other speech we look at is his farewell address that he delivered on January 15th, 2009. And we chose these two speeches because they mark significant points in his administration where he is sort of reflecting on what the steps that America took and what the meaning of this war is. So this framework of imperial righteousness has 4 themes that we'll examine. One is the need for national security. A second one is the nature of the enemy. A third is the character of the American people. And a fourth is the importance of freedom and democracy. So I'll talk about the first 2, and then I'll turn it over to Wayne, who will talk about 2 more, and he'll also talk about the conclusions that we draw. So looking at the first category, which is the importance of national security, we note that one of the most important justifications rhetorically for war is that the safety of the nation is at stake. So the president did need to convey that defending the United States was critical, and in both speeches he reaffirmed this importance by outlining all of the steps that the administration had taken to protect America. Some of these steps were a little bit controversial, so he had to talk about that and demonstrate the success of these initiatives. But while he says that we've taken these steps and we've made America safer, he has to make sure that Americans do not become complacent. And so in his farewell address, he says, while our nation is safer than it was 7 years ago, the gravest threat to our people remains another terrorist attack. And he warns, we must keep our resolve and we must never let our guard down. In putting forward this need for national security, Bush also made explicit arguments for the need to take preemptive military action. At the 5-year anniversary point, he said on September the 11th, we learned that America must confront threats before they reach our shores, whether those threats come from terrorist networks or terrorist states. And this argument that the United States must prevent terrorism from reaching its shores is one of the most compelling foundations for the righteousness of preemptive military action. So the second theme I'll talk about is the nature of the enemy, and scholars of presidential rhetoric have talked about the importance of creating a rhetorical enemy that can help marshal people's support for a war and provide a rationale for the war. And as we all recall, in the aftermath of 9/11, President Bush faced some unique rhetorical challenges. Most presidents can point to a leader or a nation state that has either declared war against the United States or committed some kind of hostile action. And of course, in this case, everything was much fuzzier. So Bush had to try to personify who the enemy was. And at the 5-year anniversary of 9/11, he was very specific about naming people and groups who had attacked America and were still enemies. He said 19 men attacked us with a barbarity unequaled in history. Of course, he talked about Osama bin Laden. He talked about what he called remnants of Saddam Hussein's regime. And he also tried to imbue these characters or these enemies with personal evil qualities. In 2006, he said, on 9/11, our nation saw the face of evil. He also tried to personify this enemy by talking about why they hated us. He said, dangerous enemies have declared their intention to destroy our way of life. And I'll finish this theme by noting that while one of the challenges that President Bush faced was personifying this enemy who was a little bit, sort of vague and abstract. He also needed to make sure that he drew a line between practitioners of Islam and the Muslim attackers who had carried out the attack on 9/11. So he needed to not demonize all Muslims. And so he's very consistent throughout his administration in characterizing the enemy as extremists who were driven by a perverted vision of Islam, and also called them a small band of fanatics, and again tried to separate them from the vast majority of Muslims. So I'll turn it now over to Wayne.
Yeah, and I'll talk about American character and morality first. In the Rhetoric of Imperial Righteousness, this is the moral obligation to protect others in the cause of right. We argue that the rhetoric suggests that we look to what is good and socially responsible as an obligation of empire. And one of the more common precepts of American morality is that Americans are ready and willing to rise to whatever task is put before them. And indeed, Bush consistently posited that since 9/11, America was composed of ordinary citizens, as he says, rising to the occasion and responding with extraordinary acts of courage. He almost always talks about these individual acts of courage, and then also talks about the armed forces and the sacrifices that they have made. Now, when liberty is challenged, we see liberty triumph with sacrifice and this determination. And this justice is important, and we see it throughout Bush's rhetoric. Bush confirmed, going back to one of the things that Ann said, that this quest for justice would be relentless. He says, our message to them is clear. No matter how long it takes, America will find you and we will bring you to justice. And that theme is heard in quite a lot of Bush's speeches. Patriotism is another component of American morality, and it also demands courage to do what is right. And this courage that we're talking about is a very humble form of courage that sincerely speaks to the soul of the American character. On several occasions, Bush stated that America did not ask for this war, and everybody wishes it was over. But again, as Ann remarked, we must resist complacency, and we have been given solemn responsibilities that we need to fulfill. Faith is also an important part of American morality, and it's used quite frequently, both from his personal perspective and faith in the American people. American morality gives the rhetoric of imperial righteousness compassion and ethics. Grounded in faith and predicated on the inherent goodness of Americans, the rhetoric defends the empire in an ethical and socially responsible way. Now, with regards to democracy and freedom, George Bush was certainly not the first U.S. president to advocate for democracy and freedom worldwide, but he certainly made it a mainstay of his political foreign policy, especially after 9/11. Using the ideas of democracy and freedom, he argued that the United States embraced both its democratic ideologies and also sought to protect that democratic agenda abroad. There's a frequent metaphor, military metaphor that he uses. He says the strongest weapon in our arsenal is the power of freedom. And I think that's an important rhetorical argument for him to make. He also talks about the clash between democracy and other forms of government as a clash of civilizations. Now, also, we need to assist emerging democracies. He says that we set in motion a course for the new century, and that we will lead the 21st century into a shining age of human liberty. And that's an interesting perspective, because now democracy and freedom is not just political change, but it also is the betterment of all human beings. Now, the theme of democracy and freedom argumentatively served the rhetoric of imperial righteousness in a couple of ways. It's imperial in the promotion and cultivation of democracies outside of the United States, and it's righteous in that it upholds the belief that the promotion of democracy and freedom also promotes human rights, human liberty, and human dignity. Now, a couple of real quick conclusions. First, if you kind of realize these four themes work in concert with each other. A president cannot promote democracy and freedom domestically or worldwide if the country is not secure. In addition, the moral character of the American people is thrown into relief by the contrasting characterization of the enemy. Furthermore, the character of the American people is innately tied to the values of democracy and freedom that all Americans revere and that the enemy despises. So there's this overlap of all of the different themes. Second of all, it allows any U.S. president to justify preemptive military action as a duty of the United States. The rhetoric creates a bridge between the logical, pragmatic reasons to engage in military conflict and the emotional imperative to protect national security, democracy, freedom, and the American people. And then finally, the rhetoric of imperial righteousness functions as a discursive closure, because the themes of imperial righteousness establish the argument that military action is morally right. Opposing viewpoints, by definition, are not righteous or patriotic. And so this puts the loyal opposition in a rhetorical bind by creating a false dichotomy. And opponents of military action cannot mount a righteous argument for their position, and supporters of military action gain momentum in the public debate. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Ben Voth with his paper, President Bush's Rhetoric and Policy Against Genocide.
All right. Thank you, Philip. I do want to begin by saying thank you to Hofstra University. As a grad student and as a professor, I have long thought that this conference is among the most important in terms of establishing what we know about the American presidency, so it's a great honor to be here today and to present about the presidency of George W. Bush. I begin with some remarks made by noted Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who rather famously observed, "What hurts the victim most is not the physical cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." And so in my paper, I'm addressing the question of genocide, and we're trying to have a sense of the American presidency and its role in breaking the silence surrounding genocide. And of course, President Bush had an important role in that regard. The 20th century witnessed more than 150 million people perishing in genocides and actions like the Armenian genocide, of course the Holocaust in Germany and Poland, the Cambodian genocide, and the Rwandan genocide, just to name a few. Ironically, despite that terrible tragedy, recent research suggests that violence is on the decline. Professor Steven Pinker and his work has documented a rather dramatic decline in human violence. And that gives rise to a special problem that I seek to address this morning in this study on President Bush. Pinker observed in an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2011, whatever its causes, the implications of the historical decline of violence are profound. So much depends on whether we see our era as a nightmare of crime, terrorism, genocide, and war, or as a period that in the light of the historical and statistical facts is blessed by unprecedented levels of peaceful coexistence. So in my analysis this morning, I hope to elaborate for you how President Bush took decisive rhetorical, argumentative, and policy actions to reduce genocide here in the 21st century. In particular, I'm focusing on the case studies of Iraq, Sudan, and Liberia. And when we study President Bush's rhetoric, what we find, and Wayne and Ann have already well highlighted, is that he uses the terminology of freedom as a way of galvanizing U.S. policy against genocidaires such as Saddam Hussein, Omar Bashir, and Charles Taylor. Of course, this conference will cover extensively the war on terror. And September 11th was, without question, a defining rhetorical framework for the Bush administration. And in his September 20th address to Congress, President Bush laid out that rhetorical framework. I'm not going to go into great depth there. Other panelists, I'm sure, will. But what I would draw from that speech by President Bush was this phrase, "Freedom and fear are at war." And so that dialectic became the basis of an ongoing policy and rhetoric by President Bush that often engaged the question of genocide that is very important. In 2003, President Bush, in front of the National Endowment for Democracy, made the point that Middle East people are not exempt from the expectations of liberty. And he raised questions about whether we would simply abandon them to the throes of violence and even genocidal violence. And the rhetoric and public arguments of President George W. Bush bear great significance in our current international scene, combating incredible violence on the streets of Paris and in northern regions of Nigeria. Bush's arguments for freedom in the Middle East were central concerns for his 2 presidential terms. And so this is not, as we've already talked about on this panel, unique to President Bush. American presidents have agreed to some extent with a notion of American exceptionalism, which is a notion of democracy and freedom, not just for the United States, but even globally. For example, the Gettysburg Address, which much of us know, concludes in this manner that would be familiar to most American presidents. "We take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Of course, we all know those words from Lincoln, and those have resounded through American presidential rhetoric, and including President Bush's. This can also be found in President Bush's second inaugural speech of 2005, and presidential second inaugurals tend to focus upon foreign policy and the kind of questions like genocide that I'm trying to focus upon. In that speech, President Bush said, "There is only one force of history that can break the reign of hatred and resentment and expose the pretensions of tyrants and reward the hopes of the decent and tolerant, and that is the force of human freedom. Across the generations, we have proclaimed the imperative of self-government because no one is fit to be a master and no one deserves to be a slave. Advancing these ideals is the mission that created our nation. It is the honorable achievement of our fathers. Now is the urgent requirement of our nation's security and the calling of our time." And so the 2005 inaugural was an important template for President Bush's rhetoric. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, I'm going to completely skip over the case study of Iraq. But I will just say this. I think it would be a terrible tragedy if history somehow recorded that Saddam Hussein never had weapons of mass destruction. Obviously, the victims at Halabja, the Kurds who died there from a chemical weapons attack initiated by Saddam Hussein, would certainly differ if they were alive to speak to that matter today. So obviously the war against Iraq was important to the overall question of genocide. But let me skip over that and move to the case study of Sudan. And in Sudan, we find an interesting case because Sudan is not a place where the United States deployed military troops, but it was shadowed by the important questions coming out of the Clinton administration, where there was a refusal to call the Rwandan genocide a genocide. And so it was that problem in mind that Colin Powell went before the Congress in 2003 with a public asking, is Sudan a genocide, as was the case in Rwanda? So would this new Secretary of State refuse to name a genocide the killing of 2 million people in Sudan? The naming of Sudan as a genocide during those congressional hearings was a marked departure from the Rwandan era. The naming of Sudan as an ongoing genocide during the Bush administration laid the groundwork for anti-genocide actions by the African Union. Roughly 17,000 troops were deployed by them. It led to a peace treaty in Sudan in 2005, and ultimately, more recently, the complete separation of South Sudan from North Sudan in 2011. President Bush made these remarks in reference to Sudan. Quote, "For too long, the people of Darfur have suffered at the hands of a government that is complicit in the bombing, murder, and rape of innocent civilians. My administration has called these actions by their rightful name, genocide. The world has a responsibility to help put an end to it. I made clear that the time for promises was over and that President Bashir had to do something to end the suffering. I call on President Bashir to stop his obstruction and to allow the peacekeepers in and to end the campaign of violence that continues to target innocent men, women, and children. And I promise to this people of Darfur, the United States will not avert our eyes from a crisis that challenges the conscience of the world." Those who study President Bush closely know that in a briefing, President Bush wrote in the margins of a briefing about Africa and the Rwandan genocide, he wrote, "Not on my watch." That became a slogan that was put on bracelets, that became a massive social campaign in the United States that pressed the Bush administration to take the policies that they did against Sudan. And I would argue that they successfully, to a large extent, mitigated the genocidal activities of Omar Bashir. Let me move to my final case study, which is Liberia. In Liberia, in 2003, we found the rather atrocious case of genocidaire Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor's military leaders, such as General Butt Naked, engaged in bizarre but inhumane rituals that led to more than 250,000 deaths in the small nation of Liberia. In 2008, General Butt Naked confessed to killing more than 20,000 of his fellow citizens. His outrageous battlefield alias was drawn from his common habit of marching into civilian annihilations wearing nothing but a pair of boots. According to the general and other observers, these slaughters began with ritualistic killings of a young child, cutting out the heart and feeding it to his loyal troops. But President Bush's speech at Senegal in 2003 about global slavery was an important era of time for the administrative decision-making about what would happen in Liberia. The speech in Senegal was significant and was the first of an American president to be broadcast globally live. In that speech, President Bush described slavery this way: "Christian men and women became blind to the clearest commands of their faith and added hypocrisy to injustice. A republic founded on equality for all became a prison for millions, And yet, in the words of the African proverb, no fist is big enough to hide the sky. All the generations of oppression under the laws of man could not crush the hope of freedom and defeat the purposes of God. He went on to say, the evils of slavery were accepted and unchanged for centuries, yet eventually the human heart would not abide them. There is a voice of conscience and hope in every man and woman that will not be silenced. What Martin Luther King called a certain kind of fire that no water could put out. That flame could not be extinguished at the Birmingham jail. It could not be stamped out at Robben Island prison. It was seen in the darkness here at Goree Island, where no chain could bind the soul. This untamed fire of justice continues to burn in the affairs of man, and it lights the way before us, unquote. Ultimately, President Bush would make the difficult decision in the midst of the Iraq War to deploy limited U.S. troops to neighboring Liberia. This would remove Charles Taylor from power and usher in Sirleaf as the new leader of Africa, the first female president on the continent of Africa. And it's interesting, I think, today to think about how would we be dealing with the Ebola crisis if we still had Charles Taylor as the leader of that country. So that's an important, decisive action. And so, in conclusion, I would just say that I think that President Bush took important actions to break the silence surrounding genocide. Were the leaders to stay as they were in the 3 countries that I listed, more than 4 million additional people would have died in just those 3 locations if those changes had not been made. So I speak in appreciation of the breaking of the silence surrounding genocide and the actions and rhetoric of President Bush. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We'll take the next 15 minutes to hear from Peter Baker and his response to these papers.
Well, thank you very much. I think those are great papers. I read all 3, and I really enjoyed them. And what I really enjoyed about these papers was how you all make sense of things I watched up close and couldn't figure out for the life of me. No, it's really interesting because we're now passing from the period of you know, real-time, 24/7 kind of fast-moving, sort of incoherent, sometimes seeming events, and trying to distill them into discernible patterns, broader themes, broader context. And I really enjoy all three papers for that reason. Philip, your paper, you didn't mention it here, but you referenced the Trojan War as your archetype that you're talking about. And I would love to have covered the Trojan War. I have to say, I would have thought that would have been a wonderful experience. And I'm really sorry I didn't get that chance. But you talk about the mistakes that President Bush made, or at least admits that he made, or believes he made, or is willing to discuss. And the one that I think that he kind of misses in his memoir, To Precision Points, which was, by the way, a bestseller. It's interesting. It you know, as unpopular as President Bush was when he left office, and still is to an extent. It was a runaway bestseller. Random House, I think, was a bestseller for at least a year, if not for multiple years, which says something about where the country is. That there are, you know, we have to understand that while people here may not like him, people there do, and you know, we're filled with people with very strong points of view in his country, and he governed, in fact, during very polarized times, as is President Obama. But the leadership style that I thought defined a lot of what he confronted was this idea that he was going to be, he called it sort of a CEO president. I mean, he had this Harvard MBA experience, and he had this idea that he didn't want to micromanage on issues, right? The president's job, in his view, was to set large goals, to find the right people, and then to empower them to do, to carry out these missions, in effect. And he was clearly influenced by this idea, at least, correct or not, of LBJ hovering over maps and deciding where the bombs should be dropped in Vietnam, and this is wrong, and this, in his view, this is something he wasn't going to do. The flip, and you can understand why, it's certainly a legitimate, defensible argument for leadership and how to approach a war situation, but I think the problem was that he found that he, in fact, had detached himself from decisions that he arguably should have been more involved in. You mentioned the decision to disband the Iraqi army. He had decided, in effect, before sending Jerry Bremer over there, that they would not do that they would only disband the Republican Guards, the most elite units, that they would not extend de-Baathification, which is the process of getting rid of Saddam's party people, so deep that you would get to, say, teachers and government workers who simply joined the party because you had to get a job. And then when Jerry Bremer comes along and says, that's not the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it this way, Bush defers and says, okay, you're the guy on the ground, I trust you, you do it. And you, again, you can sort of understand why he might do that. Similarly, the strategy changes from a quick withdrawal to a longer occupation, and he again accedes to this idea. And then the Rumsfeld strategy adopted with General Abizaid is to, okay, we're going to hand over the war in effect to the Iraqis. And part of the problem is that we're here and that we ourselves are creating part of the problem by our occupation status. Again, a completely logical argument, but one that in fact ultimately turned out not to be effective, because they just ultimately were deciding to let politics solve the security problem rather than have security first, that allow space for a political solution. And it takes 3 years for President Bush to finally assert himself and say, okay, I'm actually now overruling in effect all these decisions that the people under me have made. And he does it, this is the surge, right? This is the really more extraordinary presidential decisions that a president's made in modern times, because he goes against the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he gets against his commanders on the ground, against his own Secretary of State, the Democrats who've just won Congress, frankly, the Republicans in Congress, and he decides, no, I'm gonna take decisive action. And one of the disappointments in his book is I wish we would hear him talk a little bit more about that. Like, how does he come around to that realization about how he, how deeply as a president you are supposed to act. What else? A couple other. You mentioned the blame reversal, and it's interesting because, in fact, as you point out, he takes a different position than some other presidents who try to like shuffle off everything. He does take responsibility on some things. There's one thing that came up in the last few months that was particularly interesting, this torture debate we've had after the CIA report, in which in this book he tells us he's the one who approved these torture techniques. And the papers of the Senate committee came out with, the Democratic majority of the Senate committee came out with, said the CIA never briefed him on the specific techniques until 2006. And John Rizzo, who was the CIA general counsel, came out and said, he wrote a book actually, and his book said, I don't understand this. I don't think we ever actually told President Bush what the specific techniques were. Why is he claiming responsibility for something that's obviously so horrible and so scandalous, and yet he's taking ownership of it, even though he might not have had something to do with it. He could have, through this practice of deferred management, as we just talked about, disclaim some responsibility. In fact, he's going the other way around. He doesn't want to be seen as detached from it. And I think Philip made this point that he's trying to combat the image of being somebody who wasn't engaged enough. And so he's willing to take ownership of something that frankly is quite unpopular and quite, produces scandal, rather than look like he didn't have anything to do with it. And that's, I guess, often a conundrum for presidents. Do you want to look like you didn't know what was going on, or that you were involved in something that didn't work out really well? And that's not a great choice, I guess, for any of these guys. The paper by Ann and Wayne, I think, gets at something so important, because he does, I was really struck by President Bush's second term inaugural address, because it really, as you say, it's not like the first president to talk about liberty. I mean, Kennedy, Reagan, all these guys is a standard trope of presidents. But he seemed to take it to a different level, as you said. I mean, he seemed to make it much more of a philosophical centerpiece for what he was trying to do. And Dan Bartlett, who was one of his top aides, told me that the thinking behind this was, I mean, you're right that he talked about it in 2003 and so forth, but 2005, when he comes up with the inaugural address, they're trying to recast, in effect, the war on terror as something more positive and uplifting than simply, we're going to kill them before you kill us, right? Because it's in effect, the war on terror, which is, we're going to drone you, we're going to missile you, we're going to, it's a fundamentally depressing kind of war, right? And you want to believe that you're going to aspire to greater things, and the greater thing is freedom and democracy around the world. But it also becomes this case study in the conflict in every presidency between aspiration and reality, between rhetoric and the messy nature of the world. And he gives it a good try, I think, at moments, and he definitely, I think, has his heart in it. But it just becomes so complicated when Egypt is your ally on fighting terrorism, but meanwhile Hosni Mubarak is jailing Ayman Noor. And do you throw overboard a longtime friendly American ally who you need in that region because he is a despot? Or is the despotism, the thing that matters? And for a while, they were very tough with Egypt. Condi Rice cancels a visit because they had jailed Ayman Noor. This is the opposition leader. But then later in the presidency, they finally kind of have this moment on Air Force One where he's going into Egypt and he's going to give a speech, and he's going to be standing next to Mubarak, and they take out not all of it, but they soften the democracy and chiding kind of language that he had in there. And I think I love this study that you've done of looking at rhetoric and how we justify wars and what we want the country to believe that they're fighting for, because it's so important to understanding his presidency, and I think a lot of others for that matter. In fact, I think Obama, too, you mentioned the preemptive war. Obama's rationale for ISIS right now is, in effect, preemptive war. He has acknowledged they do not threaten us right now, not here anyway, in the United States, but they could in the future. And therefore, we cannot allow them to have an enclave, he says, from which they could create a new Afghanistan, in effect, and be a threat to the American homeland. That is a preemptive argument. And he hasn't acknowledged it as such. I don't think he would want to associate himself with that as such, but that's in effect what that is. And then Ben's paper on the 3 genocides is great too. And you shame me in a way because my book has so little to do with Darfur or Liberia, both of which are fascinating and amazingly important moments in his presidency that just get overshadowed, frankly, because of terrorism, because of Iraq, but are worth remembering, especially at conferences like this, and we talk about what they meant and what they didn't. And Darfur is so interesting to me because in some ways, Liberia is interesting because he does this in the thick of Iraq, and it happens in July of 2003 when everybody's focused on, what do we do there? What kind of government we got to stand up? We haven't yet begun to see the insurgency rise the way it will, but that's our central focus is Iraq. And meanwhile, with virtually nobody paying attention, the President of the United States lands Marines in an obscure African country that nobody in the United States is focusing on in order to accomplish, as you say, a very humanitarian type goal. And I traveled with him to Liberia in 2008, the last year of his presidency, and it's a striking place. It's so extraordinarily primitive and poor and racked by this horrific experience that they had. We literally had no power, no phone lines, and he can't stay overnight, of course. There's no security for a president to go into a place like that. And my friend Helene Cooper, who works with me at the New York Times, has written a very evocative book, by the way, about Liberia. You should definitely read her own upbringing there called The House at Sugar Beach, and she's got a new book that will come out soon about Ellen Sirleaf, which will be really interesting. And I think your point about the Ebola crisis and what Charles Taylor there would have meant is a really smart point. And the last thing I'll say about this is just Darfur, because I think Darfur is interesting in and of itself, but also interesting in a sense as the consequences, in this case, not a good one, of the Iraq experience, because Bush is passionate about this. He cares personally about what's happening in Darfur. He does not want this to happen on his watch, as Ben has told you, and yet he feels frustrated and hamstrung by the limitations of, first of all, the UN, which is a feckless and incapable organization as far as he's concerned, and secondly, by the world reaction to what he has done in Iraq, right? He feels he cannot use military force to intervene in Darfur, the idea of a no-fly zone, the idea of helicopters going in, all considered, all rejected, because as he puts it, and he says this in private, he says, it'll be, I'm invading another Muslim country, and he kind of puts it that way. He's kind of mocking, the notion that this is, a Christian versus Muslim thing, when in fact it's the opposite. It's actually trying to humanitarian aspiration. But he feels hamstrung by Iraq and Afghanistan, but particularly Iraq, and feels he cannot act in the way he might have otherwise done. And again, that shows sort of the ripple effects of all these different decisions that presidents make. and I think it's really interesting to think about. So anyway, that's my random thoughts. I don't know if they add up to anything, but thank you very much for letting me share them.
Thank you, Peter. Before we open this up to the floor, I'd like to ask a couple questions, if I may. Philip, reading your paper about the blame game, my mind was taken to the 2004 election and the presidential debate, the first one between John Kerry and George Bush. And there were moments where Bush would respond, you know, this is tough. I'm making tough decisions. And it was kind of a, dare I say, clunky response to some of the accusations that John Kerry was making about the quality of the decisions. And it seems kind of to fit the palliative excuse that you described. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But, you know, SNL then kind of took off with that, and there was one of the people who wasn't very good at doing George Bush would stand at a lectern and say, this is tough work, this is hard. And I'm wondering if using these palliative excuses has consequences, if it can cast you, if one of the unintended consequences is to cast you as somebody who's kind of whining.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. When I did this paper, and I didn't have time when I wrote the paper, I compared Discussant's points to the memoirs of Rumsfeld and Rice and Cheney, which are much more aggressive. Use the idea of blame reversal and spreading the blame much more extensively. So there is a real dichotomy between those three and President Bush's. And I think of all the chapters, and some of them are very poignant. I didn't mention, you know, his first decision is the decision to stop drinking, which is a very moving chapter. And as you can see from my talk, I'm not a big supporter of the former president, so I was kind of touched by that chapter as well. There is, I think, a problem of piling on palliative excuses that makes you, again, vulnerable and, in a sense, kind of blameworthy. And I think the chapter on Katrina, which I think is quite honest in terms of the mistakes that President Bush made, by the time you're end of that chapter, you think, boy, he really screwed up that whole thing, and he shows you how he screwed it up, and then he does say, what I should have done, I should have sent troops in earlier and this and that and so forth, and so on. So it is an inventive inoculation, but used to its extreme can get like the Saturday Night Live.
Ann and Wayne, there are two unique elements to the circumstances Bush finds himself in, which is that this war that he is seeking to take us into is preemptive, and it's not against a nation. Nevertheless, the characteristics of imperial righteousness, there's some similarities between that and what Robert Ivy describes as the savagery of a villain in a war. What I mean by that then is that there's something very traditional about his response, conventional about his response to this, but the circumstances aren't conventional, and they set precedents going forward, such as with Obama and ISIS. Does this rhetoric, this traditional or conventional rhetoric against a non-traditional opponent, trap us into going to war against enemies and that can't be conventionally overcome?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, we've done a little bit of work with this framework, applying it to some of President Obama's rhetoric. And what we find, and Peter, your example is so on point, the example of ISIS, and we haven't looked at that specifically, but what we find is when it comes to things like articulating a national security strategy, Obama's rhetoric is very similar to Bush's. And I think what that tells us is that even though they would both point to, their political differences, I think, in a sense, they are constrained, I'll say, by a little bit by the circumstances. We're moving, obviously, into a a new world of thinking about foreign influences, right? In that, you know, we're going to have, terrorism is not going away. We're going to have to always account for it. And I think, at least so far, in the transition to this next administration, we're seeing the current president really sticking with some of these rationales, very much like Bush did. You know, it's hard to project ahead, but at least that's what we've seen so far.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, since this is a longer work, you know, we initially looked at the speeches immediately after 9/11, and we thought about it in that context, that this provides a very unique opportunity for a U.S. president to have to justify some sort of action. And so that was in some ways the impetus for this initial research. And one of the early works that we looked at was a work by Robert Friedenberg, who looked at the rhetoric of Teddy Roosevelt. And so we sort of looked at some of those frameworks, who actually never deployed troops. And so we looked at some of those categories, and we found, well, they're in some ways remarkably similar to what we're faced with now. And they also have evolved as we went through immediately after 9/11 through the next administration, I mean, his second administration.
Thank you. And Ben, the question I have for you has to do with the language of freedom that's being employed against genocide. You quote at one point Bush saying that the force of freedom will overcome. What is the force of freedom, concretely? You describe it as an ideograph in the paper, but what does it, as an ideograph, what does it represent?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does represent, that's kind of why I referenced Lincoln a little bit on the Gettysburg Address and things like that, but I think autonomy, self-choosing, you know, what does an individual get to decide? In a book that I do that's kind of outside of this paper, I talk about a notion of discursive complexity, which is sort of our tolerance for multiple points of view. You know, freedom has that characteristic, like the First Amendment, where I can say something in disagreement. Like, we as panelists can agree and disagree, but when we cannot disagree, we know we don't have freedom. And it is sort of one of those negative things, like when we don't have it, we know it acutely that we don't have freedom. But of course, autonomy and choosing are probably the most intimate parts of freedom, I would think.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open it up to folks who have questions for the panel. So I know we have a microphone. I think we do. Yes, we do. And it's coming your way.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. Yeah. So I'm Graham Dodds from Concordia University, and I've got a question that I think is relevant to political communication and President Bush. It's, I think, chiefly for Peter Baker. I'd be happy to hear what others have to say. I confess I've wanted to ask this for some time, and I even wrote it up, so if you'll indulge me for a minute. So in December 2005, The Times revealed that Bush had directed the NSA to engage in domestic spying on American citizens, and this was very controversial. There was a lot of criticism. The day after the revelation, the Senate refused to reauthorize the Patriot Act. Now later, The Times revealed that it had sat on the story for 15 months, that executive editor Bill Keller had assented to a request from the Bush administration to sit on the story, and did so until after the 2004 election. And it became clear even later that The Times revealed it only then because reporter James Risen had threatened to reveal it himself in a book. Now I've got two questions about this. First, was Keller's decision the right one, even though it later cost The Times, which was excluded from the Snowden revelations that went to the Post and the Guardian, winning them Pulitzer Prizes? And secondly, if Keller had had the courage to include this in all the news that's fit to print, would Kerry have won, or would this news have convinced 59,301 Ohioans, less than 1% of the electorate, to vote for the other guy?
Thank you.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Those are great questions. Those are great questions. Let me start by saying that I joined the Times in 2008, 3 years later. Although, if I remember correctly, I was called, as the Washington Post at the time, I was called the night that their story ran and asked to chase it, which is never a fun thing for a journalist. Was Keller right? I'm not gonna give you an answer that's satisfying. I'm a big fan of Bill Keller. I think he's a terrific journalist, and I think he's a professional. He made the decision he thought was the best one he could make at that time in a difficult moment. Did he make it for political reasons, as some people, I think, worry or suspect because it came after the election. I don't think that had any role in it whatsoever. And just knowing Bill Keller, I don't think politics entered that whatsoever. I think he took seriously his responsibility as a journalist and American to figure out what was the right thing to do. And I think that he felt that the reporting also changed over time. That, in other words, when they first considered running it, and this is secondhand, right? But I think when they were first considering running the story, they were assured that there was not a debate about its legality. And they didn't know the things that they would come to know later about the fact that there was a huge debate about its legality. And that changes your dynamic as you're thinking about whether to run a story or not. If you think that a government was ripped apart by the question of whether or not something was, you know, spying on people was legal or not, that is a more justifiable reason for publishing. In other words, the public has a right to be engaged in this debate. If there's a legitimate debate, then the public ought to have a say in it. You know, I would say, by the way, that I think that the concerns that were expressed about, you know, giving away secrets to the enemy, you know, I don't know if there's anybody here from the administration who will have a point of view on that. I've never heard yet a convincing example where somebody said to me, this happened because this was made public. This, you know, I'm sure the enemy may have changed his tactics in some way or another, but nobody's ever said, this attack happened. You know, that was what Bill Keller was told, by the way, by President Bush in the Oval Office. He didn't use these words, but this is when Bill Keller left, the words he heard in his mind, the ones he would tell you today, is that he was told he would have blood on his hands if he put in this story. Again, Bush didn't use those exact words, but that was the implication of the message that Bill heard anyway when he walked out. That's a tough thing for a journalist to think about. I think today my guess is he would tell you he probably has a different view of whether he should have held on to it for a year or not. Would Kerry have won? I don't know. You know, it depends. I mean, if it came out the day before the election, maybe that would be such a shocker that people would, you know, I think elections are baked into a bigger set of things, and I think people were upset about this, but I don't know how much it changed people's views of Bush per se. It's a good question. You're right, and you're right, by the way, to focus on the people in Ohio. Like, it's not some esoteric question. There's a very specific set of people who would have had to have changed their minds in order to have changed the result. But it's, you know, it's a great case study in the question of journalism and our responsibility to publish information that we know is relevant to the country versus our concerns about not doing damage to national security if that case can be made. And Bill Keller has made these decisions again and again and again, and I think always with the best motivations at heart, trying to find the right balance. When WikiLeaks came out, we didn't just take it and put it all up on the website. And neither did the Washington Post, by the way, with the Snowden documents. The journalists spent a lot of time vetting these documents, reporting them out, trying to figure out what happened, what do we understand, what did they actually tell us, not just sort of randomly typing and letting it go, because there were consequences. Some of these WikiLeaks cables had the names of informants in Afghanistan who could have easily been, in fact, people I think were moved out of the country as a result of the fact that WikiLeaks put them out, not us. So there are consequences. We do take them seriously, but I think it also shows that there's a value to journalism, even if it's belated.
Thank you. Next question.
For one, did you draw any distinction in your paper between the rhetoric used by Bush in the Afghan war and the Iraq war? Secondly, you used the term preemptive war, which is how the Bush administration cast it, but of course with respect to the Iraq war, it was really preventive war, but we understand that the administration would rather stand on the well-heeled doctrine of preemptive war, but that implies under international law a direct, clear, and imminent threat. And then it goes to Peter Becker, by virtue of your reference to President Obama and ISIS. If the Obama administration is going to assert that this is preemptive war, then he too must be willing to embrace what you indicated he's not willing to do, is that ISIS poses a direct, immediate, imminent threat to the United States. If not, then it could be arguably an exercise in preventive war. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. That's an excellent question. And to date, we have not made that distinction between Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think that could be useful. When we started this project, we really were interested in how he was framing this war on terror. And so the rhetoric that we were looking at and the symbolic categories that we were interested in really were more general. But now that you've said that, you've made me very curious to go back and maybe parse that a little bit more. Similarly, we had not also made a distinction between preventive and preemptive war. We took our cue from Bush, really, in saying that was the way he was framing that. Although, again, now that you've said that, I'm thinking that would be interesting to go back with that frame and that definition in mind and see if a difference would shake out.
But we did look at a variety of different texts and different documents from the speeches, like I said, immediately after 9/11. There was the Kerry debates that we looked at. We looked at the national security strategies that he produced, which are written documents. So we did look at a variety of texts with regards to forming this framework.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the preemptive, because if you get into, you'll hear Peter Fever, I think, is going to be at this conference later, and he can give you a whole lot more history and the distinction between those two. You know, the one letter makes a big difference, especially to those who follow the laws of war. I don't get as wrapped up in that as some of them. I think we sort of use them interchangeably, probably sloppily, I suppose. But the point being, right, is do you know, at what point is a threat a genuine casus belli, right? And it seems to me that the ISIS threat at this point is a more theoretical one, right? They've now obviously tragically and horrifically killed a number of our citizens, but in relatively small numbers, not to minimize that, but not usually the cause of war by itself. So if you take that off the table as a rationale, what the Obama people will say is, no, they're not a threat to the United States currently, but they could become one, and they are a threat to our allies, and that the broader threat of dislocation and disruption in the Middle East, the idea that we're going to suddenly have this new country, in effect, formed out of two other countries without any kind of consent, is obviously a broader danger that doesn't have to mean a bomb will go off in the middle of New York City. And they would not engage on the argument, isn't this the same thing, in effect, that Bush was saying about the WMDs in the hands of a despot like Saddam Hussein? Isn't that a threat, even if it's not an immediate one? They wouldn't like to go there. But as a matter of law, what's interesting, of course, is they're relying on the 2002 and the 2001 authorization to use force that Congress passed. The first one, 2001, was passed after 9/11, was specifically going after Al-Qaeda and those in effect like Al-Qaeda. It's become a very elastic authorization. And the 2002 one was about Iraq specifically. And he has said that he would accept a different authorization from Congress if it wants to, but he's been at war now for 7 months and doesn't seem to really mind the current legal situation, as presidents often do, because presidents have expanded their war power so substantially since FDR, since the end of World War II, when we went to Korea, Vietnam, and so on, without a formal declaration of war. And I think this shows that the point you guys just made, which is right, which is that there is in fact more commonality between presidencies, even of vastly different political stripes like Obama and Bush, than we might like to imagine.
Just on that point, when we presented our paper looking at Obama and Bush, we got pushback. This was at an academic conference, and people, after we did our presentation, said that just can't be. And we kept saying, well, you read the paper, we make our arguments, and we quote passages of the speech, and everyone, of course, can judge for her himself. But people were resistant to that message.
I do think sitting in that chair, and every morning, somebody walks into that Oval Office and either gives you a paper or sits down and tells you orally all the different ways that somebody is trying to kill Americans today, and it's your responsibility, Mr. President, to not let that happen. I think that's a terrible burden, and I think the choices available to them are awful, and none of them great. President Obama says in private, he says, there are only shitty options. That's his phrase, not mine. And his version of trying to be different than President Bush is, don't do stupid shit. That's his foreign policy, as in a nutshell, 4 words. And his argument would be that President Bush did do stupid shit, but the choices were not vastly different, and the choices are not appealing, frankly, on any level.
I just had one thought, is that if you think about Cold War presidents, there was one sort of iconic doctrine, containment. And we don't know yet if preemption will become the equivalent in the next era of containment. But if you look at the containment doctrine, the connections between going to war or sending troops in and national security was always a little bit tenuous too. I mean, that was the whole idea of the domino theory, that Vietnam was not a threat per se, but if we don't do this, we don't do this, and so forth and so on. And preemption has some of the same sort of features about it, I think. And if in fact preemption becomes a doctrine for decades to come, then our assessment of the Bush presidency might change a bit. Some of the early evaluations of President Bush did make comparisons with President Truman, who set out foreign policy principles in a new era.
Next question.
I had the sense when I was living through this period that for some reason there was a tremendous pressure not to say anything. It was criticism was kind of flattened out. Newsmen could not really criticize in a open way. I don't know if I'm right about this or not, but I sort of looked at Dan Rather and felt like he was more of a victim of stepping out of the box a little bit more, even though he was criticized for his research, than him actually saying anything that was particularly that wrong that they threw him off of CBS. So I'm wondering, do you feel that? Did you feel that at all, or is it just my paranoid sensibilities?
I think, real quickly, I didn't feel that, and I don't have none of my colleagues have said to me that they felt that. I do think that journalists are people and Americans, and I think that there was a mood in the country that at that time that, you know, had a certain momentum behind it. You know, there was a certain fear and a certain uncertainty and a certain appetite for action, let's say, that I think that the country as a whole kind of, you know, not everybody in it, right, but a substantial part of the country kind of got wrapped into, and you know, arguably we journalists went along with that too much. In the book, I quote an unnamed Bush administration official who says that the reason he thinks we went to war with Iraq, this is somebody who was deeply involved in the Iraq War and later came to regret it, says, I tell people today the reason we went to war in Iraq is because Afghanistan was too easy. And we, you know, we meaning the country, but also the Bush administration, you know, we needed somebody's ass to kick, is what he says. And I think there was something to that. And I think that you can argue that journalists, you know, we should look back, and we have looked back at what we did then and tried to make sure that we apply the appropriate balance of scrutiny and accountability to our leaders. And I think that's shaped a lot of things since then, right? The skepticism that people felt about President Obama's decision, since then aborted, to strike Syria in 2013 is part of our hangover. What's happening now with Iran, part of our hangover. If we end up bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, that's either preventive or preemption, but it's certainly not a direct, you know, immediate threat to the United States. And so I think people's skepticism about the intelligence about Iran, that's part of the hangover of Iraq. People don't want to make the same mistake twice. So I don't feel like, I don't know there's any, I never felt any dissent being squelched. I'm sure there might be others who did, but I was also in Afghanistan and at that time, so I might not have felt everything.
Okay, next question.
This is a really interesting panel. I'm really enjoying all of you. I guess I can throw this out to all of you. Did President Bush ever think that this war would go on for so long?
I will say that in some of the speeches I covered in the paper, he did say repeatedly that this would be a long war. I think, the public has a sense of, we'd like it to be short and we'd like it to be, quick and easy, maybe kind of the way that Peter was just talking about with Afghanistan, but there are repeated references in the speeches that it will take a long time. And I would say, and that's one of the things I like about the Hofstra conference, in terms of looking at presidents long term, it's sort of, I would say, a post-Vietnam phenomena that we now say, oh, we withdraw. Because I mean, we have troops in Korea, we have troops in Japan, we have troops all over the world that, we don't have this kind of beleaguered sense of like, oh, when are they coming home? But after Vietnam, there became this new norm, which is, oh, the troops come back after 6 months. I don't know what the time frame is of short, but the public wants it like a sitcom, like in 30 minutes, we just resolved this.
I would add, I think Ben's right about the broader, in effect what he's talking about is the global war on terror, to use the phrase that Bush liked to use. I think he did in fact say all the time that was going to take a long time. It's a generational struggle. There won't be a victory celebration on the deck of the Missouri as there was in Tokyo. I think on Iraq, though, I think you're right that he expected it to be a much easier, cleaner thing than it was. I think he thought it would be, okay, we did Afghanistan, we're going to do Iraq, and then we'll look around and see what's next and see what other, you know what I mean? I think he had this World War II almost image in his head that, we moved from North Africa to Italy, and I think that what they didn't count on was, and they were right in the sense that when Cheney gets blasted for saying it would be, liberation and there'd be, they'd be greeted as liberators, he was right for a few weeks. People did hate Saddam. I spent a little time in Saddam's Iraq. They hated Saddam. What we didn't understand was they also didn't like us, and that they weren't necessarily thrilled that we would be there either. And partly because he had poisoned their minds, he had told them that all the hardships they had suffered under sanctions were our fault because of the sanctions, even while he was ripping off the country. Partly because we had been bombing the northern and southern halves, we had abandoned the Shiites, arguably, in 1991. All these things added up to a cauldron in Iraq that we didn't fully understand, and Bush didn't fully understand. And I don't think he ever thought it would be what it turned into. If that's your question, I think that part's right. But Ben's also right. He was very good about consistently saying this is not an overnight thing overall.
Right, and I think there's also a distinction between the physical war and the ideological war. The ideological war would never end, right? Because you always will have that juxtaposition of democracy and freedom versus everything else.
So are we wrong to anticipate an end to these wars?
Well, I make a point in one writing that, the war with the Barbary pirates that Jefferson did doesn't really differ greatly from what we currently encounter in the war on terror rhetoric, which is a scary thing to think about in light of your question. You're like, oh yeah, since the inception of the American Republic, there's been a struggle. And if you look at Jefferson's long-term struggle with negotiation and diplomacy, the Treaty of Tripoli, and then you apply it to this question, it's like, yeah, it looks interminable, but it's the nature of politics.
Yeah. And my fear, Philip, is no, there will not be an end to these wars. That you will always have another group, another ISIS, another whatever, that will come up, and then we will feel the moral imperative to have to save the world from this particular group, which will eventually push us into a military conflict.
Yeah, I think your idea of righteous empire is a very fitting phrase, because this is the dilemma, really, of an empire. Rome and so forth and so on. I do recall this comment that President Bush made in 2004 to a reporter that the war on terror would never be won, or something like that. And Kerry jumped on him immediately because you're supposed to say we're going to win it.
Well, they later changed. They had a strategy in 2006 or 2005 where Iraq was going so terribly, and they had this victory strategy, and he appears at Annapolis in front of a big giant thing, and victory, victory, big victory. Ultimately, of course, that was ephemeral.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, maybe two.
I missed the very early part of it, but to Peter's point, I think it's important to note that as poorly conceived and planned as the Iraq War was, that ultimately it wasn't necessarily that the Iraqi people were poisoned to us before we went in, but that the invasion could have potentially worked to a certain extent had it not been so grossly bungled in the execution. And clearly, you know, the panelists have illustrated some of that, but I think it was very clear that once the looting of the ministries and the museums and the arms depots, and then it obviously exacerbated by the dissolution of the Ba'athist Party and the military and the intelligence services, putting legions of potential insurgents on the streets unemployed. That, I think, was the key factor in terms of why everything went to heck and why the Iraqis turned against the occupation, and not necessarily that they were predisposed to it. I think that in many ways they were predisposed to get rid of Saddam and hated him for it, but we essentially did everything possible we could to make sure that it wouldn't work.
Well, I don't disagree with you. I think there are lots of places along the way, juncture points, we could say if we had done this, maybe it would have been different if we had done that. Here's how we further alienated them. I do think that, and I say this having spent some time there, because what surprised me as a reporter walking around who didn't have a lot of experience in Iraq, so I'll confess I'm not like some sort of Iraq expert, but as a reporter spending some time there in the country at that time, I thought that they may not be disposed against us, they weren't disposed toward us. I think we underestimated that we could have handled better, and it wouldn't maybe have been a big deal. I don't mean that was the only reason that it went bad by any stretch. I just meant that I think we thought it was a more friendly environment to us than we had to work with, and then we found ways to make it even less friendly.
Can we shoehorn this one last question down here? He's been very patient.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Abbott, but the whole panel can comment. It's about the president's rhetoric during Katrina, and do you feel that he took most of the heat when his FEMA director and the governor, Bobby Jindal, and the mayor of New Orleans, do you think he protected them with, you know, his rhetoric and took most of the heat for that devastation and aftermath, et cetera?
No, that's a very interesting question. I think in some ways, outside of the chapter on Iraq, that the Katrina chapter is one of the richer recollections in the memoir. Bush does do a good amount of spreading the blame in terms of Nagin and Blanco, but then at other points when he says, well, you know, if I sent the troops in right away, here's a black mayor and a female Democratic governor, how would I have looked? And then he is particularly sort of regretful of the photo image of himself before those New York firemen right after 9/11, where he has his arm around them, he has this kind of populist, folksy view, and then the Brownie statement. And one can see, I think, in a way, with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, had Katrina been handled much more successfully, here you would have had a president that managed both rhetorically and in policy terms two really major crises, one domestic and one foreign within his presidency. And there is a sense, it's very indirect, I might be overreaching, that the president sort of realized that missed opportunity.
I would add, I think this is another example where he was deferring to people below him, right? Mm-hmm. And didn't grab onto a problem as quickly and decisively as he could or should have. I think he, as you say, admits that. I was with him on the plane when he came back from his, he was actually first in Arizona and then he went to California for this. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it did, but you know what? It should. You're the president. That's your job, and it is your. And he had been told by Max Mayfield, the National Hurricane Center guy, you know, it's going to miss it. Blah blah blah. Our newspapers, I think, had headlines saying it misses New Orleans. I mean, there was clearly, like the WMD in some ways, some bad intelligence going on here. But he didn't fully grasp at first the enormity of the problem and seize on it even in a symbolic way, much less a substantive way. And I'll tell you, I was on the plane when he went back and he did the flyover. Remember that picture of him looking out the window at the thing? And I'll tell you, this is how presidents make mistakes, because I thought that was a good idea, right? As a reporter sitting on the plane, like, yeah, okay, it makes no sense for him to fly in there. It's an active rescue zone. We literally saw a helicopter pulling somebody off of a roof from the plane below us. It would have been terrible to divert the resources that are required when Air Force One shows up away from what was really important then. So I thought there's no way for him to land. And he's flying from Texas to Washington. To not at least go by would seem callous. So this seemed to me like not a bad middle ground. And boy, was that wrong. Like, my judgment was wrong. And that tells you, I'm on the plane, he's on the plane, you get in this bubble a president does, and you start thinking things, and the people tell you, yeah, that makes sense, let's do that, and they have no conception of how the outside world would view it. So he didn't, to his credit later, he goes to New Orleans 17 times afterwards. He devotes more than $100 billion of federal money to try to recover. It's a lot like the surge, and it's a lot like the financial crisis in some ways, where early neglect is then met with overwhelming force to try to clean up the mess that unfortunately had emerged. So.
We have to sum up. Please join me in thanking our panelists. The next panel, first of all, I've been asked to announce, can be found on the app called EventBase. So if you put that on your phone and then search for Hofstra's George W. Bush Conference, you will get all of the panels on your phone. But the next one is held at 12:45, Education Policy in the Plaza Room, Presidential Leadership and the Bush Doctrine in the Goddard Theater, International Perspectives on the Bush Presidency in the East Multipurpose Room, and Homeland Security and National Security in the Student Center Theater. Thank you all for coming.
That was great. No, I love your paper. I thought it was really interesting. And it's one of the overlooked aspects of his presidency and fitting Iraq into the other ones as you do. So.
Yeah, I was just trying to lift something.
No, I'm really glad you did. That's great. That's great.
So, I liked your story about Liberia.
Oh, interesting.
Nothing I've ever studied.
Me either. I haven't thought of it, so it would be kind of
I was only the one time for like, we were on the ground for like 3-4 hours, so I don't take something.
Well, I want to look at your
Right.
colleagues' book that you're talking about.
And if so, then how do you frame that?
It's a memoir. She grew up there in a middle class family in Liberia, and just how the whole thing unraveled.
Yeah.
I also thought
I worked with her, you know,